Brooklyn had always prided herself on her hard work. For years, she had given everything to her job at the marketing firm, staying late to perfect every campaign, putting in the extra effort even when others didn't. She had been with the company since she graduated, starting as an intern and slowly working her way up to a senior position. But lately, things had started to change. Brooklyn had been waiting for her moment, the promotion she had worked so hard for. She had been told time and time again that it was only a matter of time. Yet when the day finally came, the news wasn't what she expected. Her boss, Mr. Thompson, had just promoted her coworker, Chad, instead. The same Chad who barely seemed to care about his work, always slipping by with the bare minimum. She was stunned, her heart sinking in disbelief as she listened to Mr. Thompson praise Chad's new ideas and fresh approach to marketing. Brooklyn's frustration boiled over. She had been loyal, putting in the hours, the effort, and the dedication, and now it felt like it had all been for nothing. The disappointment lingered in Brooklyn's chest as she tried to carry on with her day. But something inside her snapped. She couldn't just accept this, not after everything she had done. Something didn't feel right, and she had to find out what was going on. For the next few days, Brooklyn noticed small things: Chad getting special treatment, his projects getting approved almost instantly, while hers were brushed aside without explanation. It was clear that the promotion wasn't just about skill or effort. There was something more, but what? Brooklyn wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but she knew something was off. Her opportunity came one night when she stayed late at the office. As she worked at her desk, her curiosity got the better of her. She glanced around the office, ensuring she was alone, before she slipped into Mr. Thompson's office. She had always respected him, but now her trust was shaken. She had no intention of snooping, but something urged her to check his computer. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she needed answers. Her fingers hesitated for a moment before she opened his email inbox. The moment she clicked on a few unread messages, Brooklyn's heart raced. The first email was from Chad, discussing how they could help each other out. It was the kind of message that didn't belong in a professional workspace. Brooklyn scrolled further, her breath catching as she read more emails. Mr. Thompson had been sending Chad private updates about company decisions, offering him inside information to secure his promotion. Chad wasn't just getting lucky. He was being given opportunities and secrets that were never meant for someone like him. It wasn't just about business anymore. Brooklyn realized that Mr. Thompson had been pulling strings behind the scenes, favoring Chad for reasons far beyond his abilities. Brooklyn's mind raced as she read the emails, piecing everything together. Mr. Thompson's favoritism wasn't just an isolated incident. It had been happening for months. He had been planting ideas in Chad's head, manipulating him to think he was the company's future, all while Brooklyn, the more qualified candidate, was pushed aside. Each email, each message, painted a clearer picture of a boss who had used his position for personal gain, setting up a promotion that had nothing to do with merit. Brooklyn's hands trembled as she quickly took screenshots of the emails. She knew she couldn't just let this slide. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about integrity, fairness, and the very foundation of the company she had worked so hard to build. She didn't know what to do next, but she knew she couldn't confront Mr. Thompson alone. She needed someone on her side, someone who understood the gravity of what was happening. The next day, Brooklyn reached out to a friend from law school, Sarah, who had always been there when Brooklyn needed advice. Sarah listened carefully, her voice growing more serious as Brooklyn explained what she had discovered. Sarah suggested that Brooklyn should gather more evidence before making any rash decisions. The emails were just the tip of the iceberg, and if Brooklyn wanted to take down Mr. Thompson, she needed to be prepared for a fight. For the next week, Brooklyn worked quietly, watching, waiting, and collecting more information. She kept digging through Mr. Thompson's emails, finding more examples of his manipulation and unethical behavior. It became clear that Chad's promotion wasn't the only thing that had been influenced by Mr. Thompson's personal interests. Decisions about the company's future, the direction of projects, even hiring practices. All of them had been tainted by Mr. Thompson's selfish motives. Brooklyn couldn't ignore it any longer. She was done being silent. The truth needed to come out, and she was the one who was going to expose it. Brooklyn set her plan in motion. She arranged a meeting with Mr. Thompson, making sure to invite Sarah as her legal advisor. The meeting was scheduled in the afternoon, and Brooklyn's heart pounded in her chest as she walked into the conference room. Mr. Thompson was there, his usual confident smile on his face as he greeted them. Brooklyn could feel the tension rising, but she kept her composure. Sarah stood by her side, calm but ready for anything. Brooklyn opened her laptop, pulling up the evidence she had gathered. The emails flashed on the screen, undeniable proof of Mr. Thompson's underhanded dealings. She showed him the messages, the dates, the discussions, and the clear favoritism. Mr. Thompson's smile faded as he realized the gravity of the situation. He tried to defend himself, his voice shaking slightly, but Brooklyn didn't back down. She had the truth on her side, and she wasn't going to let him manipulate the situation any longer. For a moment, Mr. Thompson seemed to shrink in his seat. He stammered, claiming that it wasn't what it seemed, that he had only been trying to help Chad get ahead, but Brooklyn wasn't buying it. She had seen through the lies, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. Brooklyn turned to Sarah, who calmly began outlining their next steps: legal action, a formal investigation, and possibly even a lawsuit for breach of trust and ethical violations. Mr. Thompson looked defeated, his earlier confidence evaporating. He knew he couldn't talk his way out of this one. He had been caught. As the meeting ended, Brooklyn felt a rush of relief. For the first time in months, she felt like she had control over her own fate. But the journey wasn't over yet. She still had to deal with Chad and the aftermath of exposing Mr. Thompson. Would the company believe her? Would the truth finally set her free? Brooklyn didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to let anyone take what was rightfully hers again. The following days were a whirlwind. Brooklyn knew that her confrontation with Mr. Thompson wasn't just the end of one chapter. It was only the beginning. As the news of Mr. Thompson's unethical behavior spread throughout the office, Brooklyn found herself at the center of it all. People whispered behind her back, their eyes following her every move. Some were supportive, congratulating her for standing up for what was right, while others were more cautious, unsure of the full story. The office atmosphere had shifted. What was once a place of collaboration and productivity now felt tense, as though everyone was walking on eggshells, waiting for the next shoe to drop. Brooklyn couldn't help but feel the weight of it all, but she refused to let it break her. Chad, however, was another story. He seemed to act oblivious to the storm brewing around him. In fact, he acted as though nothing had changed. After Brooklyn exposed the emails, he had become even more confident. He walked around with his usual arrogance, but Brooklyn could see the cracks in his facade. He was shaken, just like Mr. Thompson. Deep down, he knew the truth, that he had only reached his position because of Mr. Thompson's manipulation, not his own merits. Brooklyn could almost feel sorry for him, but she quickly pushed that thought away. He didn't deserve her sympathy. One afternoon, just as Brooklyn was settling into her routine, she received an unexpected call from Sarah. "Brooklyn, we need to meet," Sarah said, her tone urgent. Brooklyn's heart raced as she grabbed her coat and rushed out the door. When she arrived at Sarah's office, she was greeted by a much more serious version of her friend, who wasted no time in getting to the point. "I've got some bad news," Sarah began. "I've been digging into the company's finances, and it's worse than we thought. Mr. Thompson wasn't just favoring Chad for a promotion. He was manipulating the entire department to funnel resources to projects he personally benefited from. This is bigger than just him giving Chad special treatment. There's serious financial misconduct here." Brooklyn's stomach sank. She had known Mr. Thompson wasn't trustworthy, but this went far beyond what she had imagined. The emails were bad enough, but now it was clear that Mr. Thompson's actions had put the company at risk. He had been using his position not only to further his personal interests, but to jeopardize the future of the business. Brooklyn felt a wave of anger rise within her. She had been right to trust her instincts. Sarah continued, "We have to move quickly. If we want to take him down, we need evidence, and we need to take it straight to the board. This isn't just about one man's greed. It's about protecting the company and its future." Brooklyn nodded. This was no longer just about a personal betrayal. It was about stopping someone who had abused their power and threatened the integrity of the entire company. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice steady now, a sharp contrast to the uncertainty she had felt just moments before. Sarah laid out the plan. They would gather every piece of evidence they could: documents, emails, financial records, everything they could find that tied Mr. Thompson's actions to his illegal activities. They had to make sure the board saw the full extent of his betrayal. Brooklyn's resolve hardened. She knew this was the right thing to do, and she wasn't going to back down. For the next few days, Brooklyn worked tirelessly with Sarah, poring through company records and emails, digging for any trace of Mr. Thompson's involvement in the shady dealings. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Mr. Thompson had been living a double life. Publicly, he was the charming CEO, but behind closed doors, he was a manipulative fraud. It didn't take long for them to build a solid case against him. Every email, every financial discrepancy, pointed back to his greed. But even as Brooklyn prepared to take the evidence to the board, she couldn't shake the feeling that Chad would be the next hurdle. He had been Mr. Thompson's golden boy for so long, and Brooklyn knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. He was still trying to act like the promotion was all his doing, and there was no way he would let anyone take it from him without a struggle. Brooklyn wasn't ready to face him just yet, but she knew the time would come. She just had to be patient. Everything had to happen in the right order. First, they had to take down Mr. Thompson. Then they could deal with the fallout that would come from Chad's complicity in the whole mess. The battle wasn't over, it had just begun. And as Brooklyn looked out the window of Sarah's office, she couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation building in her chest. She wasn't going to let this slide. The truth was coming out, and she was going to make sure everyone knew exactly who was responsible for the damage that had been done to the company. She had fought for this job, for her integrity, and now it was time for the rest of the world to see what she had uncovered. The pieces were falling into place. There was no turning back now. The next morning, Brooklyn arrived at work with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in a long time. The weight of what was about to happen hung heavily in the air. She wasn't just about to expose Mr. Thompson. She was about to change the course of her career and the entire company's future. But before she could take that final step, there was one more thing to do: make sure the board would take her seriously. She had spent countless hours collecting evidence, but now she had to ensure that it would make the impact she intended. Brooklyn sat at her desk, reviewing everything one last time: the emails, the financial records, the fraudulent reports Mr. Thompson had signed off on. They were all there, neatly organized, undeniable proof of his misconduct. The sound of heels clicking on the floor interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see Chad walking toward her with his usual swagger. He flashed her a smile, but there was a nervousness in his eyes that he couldn't quite hide. "Hey, Brooklyn," he said casually, leaning against her cubicle. "I heard some things are going down with Thompson. You know anything about that?" Brooklyn didn't even flinch. She had expected this conversation to come at some point. Chad was trying to feel her out, see if she was planning something, maybe even scare her off. But she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of knowing what was really going on. She kept her tone neutral, though there was a quiet strength behind her words. "I don't know what you're talking about," Brooklyn replied, keeping her eyes on the documents in front of her. "But if you're worried, maybe you should focus on your own work instead of trying to dig into mine." Chad's smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "Yeah, well, just thought you'd want to be in the loop. You know, things are changing around here. Who knows what'll happen next?" Brooklyn wasn't sure if he was genuinely trying to warn her or if he was just trying to make her feel insecure. But it didn't matter. She knew what she had to do. As soon as Chad walked away, she locked her computer and grabbed the folder with all her evidence. It was time. The meeting with the board had been scheduled for the afternoon. Brooklyn had arranged for Sarah to be there to help her present the evidence and ensure everything was handled properly. As she made her way to the boardroom, Brooklyn's nerves began to settle. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger. This was about holding people accountable for their actions, about showing that the company could thrive without the corruption that had taken root. The boardroom was already filled when she entered. Mr. Thompson sat at the head of the table, his face slightly flushed. He looked confident, but there was a tension in the air that even he couldn't hide. Chad sat beside him, and Brooklyn couldn't help but notice the way he kept glancing at her, as if he knew the storm was coming. The rest of the board members sat in silence, clearly waiting for the meeting to begin. Brooklyn took a deep breath and sat down, opening her laptop. Sarah, ever the professional, gave Brooklyn a reassuring nod before addressing the room. "We're here today because there have been serious concerns regarding Mr. Thompson's management of the company," Sarah began, her voice steady but firm. "And I'm sure you're all aware that Brooklyn has uncovered some disturbing evidence that could affect the future of the company." Mr. Thompson's face darkened as Sarah spoke, but Brooklyn could see the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't ready to admit the truth. He tried to interrupt, but Sarah cut him off. "We have emails, documents, and financial records that show Mr. Thompson has been engaging in unethical practices," Sarah continued. "He's been giving special treatment to certain employees, and those promotions were not based on merit. They were based on personal favoritism." Brooklyn opened her folder and began passing around the evidence she had collected, watching as the board members flipped through the pages, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock. Mr. Thompson's face turned an even deeper shade of red as he realized there was no way out. He tried to speak, to deny everything, but Brooklyn wasn't having it. "The emails you sent to Chad," she said calmly, "show exactly how you manipulated decisions to favor him. You used your position to ensure he was promoted, even though he wasn't qualified. You've been using your power for personal gain, and now the company is paying the price." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Chad sat back in his chair, his earlier bravado gone. He shifted nervously, glancing from Brooklyn to Mr. Thompson, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His guilt was written all over his face. Brooklyn could feel the tension in the air. The board members were still processing what they had just heard. But then, one of them, a woman Brooklyn had always respected, Karen Matthews, spoke up. "I've seen enough," Karen said, her voice sharp and decisive. "Mr. Thompson, your actions are not just unethical, they're illegal. I'm calling for an immediate investigation into these practices. We cannot allow this to continue." Brooklyn felt a surge of relief wash over her. Finally, someone was standing up for what was right. She wasn't alone in this fight. The board began murmuring amongst themselves, their voices growing louder as they discussed what to do next. Mr. Thompson was no longer the confident leader he had been walking in. He was a man on the verge of being exposed. But it wasn't just Mr. Thompson who was under scrutiny now. The room was turning its focus on Chad. He had been a part of this scheme, complicit in the favoritism and the lies. Brooklyn knew it wouldn't be long before the board turned on him too. After all, he hadn't earned his promotion on his own merits. He had been pushed forward by someone who thought they could get away with manipulation. The rest of the meeting was a blur of discussions about next steps. Brooklyn didn't care. She had done what she came to do. The truth was out, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had taken control of her future. As she stood up to leave the boardroom, she exchanged a look with Sarah. There was still more to be done, but Brooklyn knew that the battle was far from over. She was going to make sure that justice was served, and the company would never fall into the hands of people like Mr. Thompson again. But as Brooklyn walked out of the building that day, a part of her couldn't help but wonder how Chad would handle the fallout. Would he face the consequences, or would he try to weasel his way out? Either way, Brooklyn was ready for whatever came next. The days following the boardroom meeting felt surreal. Brooklyn had expected some backlash, but the support she received from her colleagues was overwhelming. Word of Mr. Thompson's misconduct spread quickly, and people began to see her in a new light, not just as a hard worker, but as someone who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. The respect from her peers was palpable. and Brooklyn couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for the steps she had taken. However, her victory was not without its challenges. Despite the evidence, Mr. Thompson wasn't going down without a fight. He was fighting tooth and nail to protect his reputation and his position at the company. He had lawyers who were already working on damage control, attempting to discredit Brooklyn and her claims. The board had agreed to an internal investigation, but Brooklyn knew that in the corporate world, power and influence could often bend the truth. She spent hours each day preparing herself for the next phase of the battle. The investigation was far from over, and she wasn't about to let her guard down. She knew that Mr. Thompson and his allies would try to twist the facts, to turn the situation around and paint her as the troublemaker. But Brooklyn was resolute. She had the truth on her side, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. Then there was Chad. He had gone quiet after the board meeting, avoiding Brooklyn at all costs. He hadn't spoken to her since the day the evidence was presented. He was still part of the company, but his newfound position felt shaky. The board had placed him under review, questioning the validity of his promotion. Brooklyn wasn't sure how far the investigation would go, but she knew that Chad would eventually have to face the consequences of his role in all of this. As Brooklyn sat in her office one morning, reviewing new emails, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Sarah. "We need to talk. Urgent." Brooklyn's stomach dropped. She knew it was going to be about the ongoing investigation. Sarah had been a constant support, helping her navigate through the legal side of things. But Brooklyn couldn't help but feel anxious every time she heard from her. She quickly replied, setting up a time to meet. When they met, Sarah was serious, her face grim. "Brooklyn," she began, "I've been in touch with some of the board members, and things are moving faster than we expected. The investigation is already starting to unravel some serious things that go beyond Mr. Thompson's actions." Brooklyn's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath, glancing around the room as if ensuring no one else was listening. It turns out, Mr. Thompson wasn't just manipulating Chad. He was funneling money into personal accounts under the guise of company expenses. And there's more. Some of those funds were being redirected into a private project of his, which no one on the board knew about. "This is bigger than we thought, Brooklyn. We're talking about financial fraud here." Brooklyn's mind spun. She had suspected that there was more to the story, but hearing it confirmed was a shock. Mr. Thompson hadn't just been playing favorites with Chad. He had been stealing from the company. This was the kind of scandal that could destroy everything he had built. Brooklyn's thoughts raced as she processed the gravity of the situation. "What happens now?" Brooklyn asked, her voice shaky. "Now we act fast," Sarah replied. "The board is finally starting to understand just how deep this goes, but we need to be prepared. If Mr. Thompson is involved in this much fraud, the company could be in serious legal trouble. They might try to bury the truth to protect themselves. We can't let that happen." Brooklyn nodded, her resolve hardening. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. It was one thing to expose a corrupt boss. It was another thing entirely to bring down a web of deceit that could collapse the company. But Brooklyn wasn't afraid. She had seen how corrupt the system could be, and now she was determined to fix it. As the investigation ramped up, Brooklyn spent her days meeting with legal teams and board members, trying to piece together the full extent of Mr. Thompson's actions. It wasn't just about taking him down anymore. It was about saving the company from total collapse. Brooklyn knew that if she wasn't careful, the damage could go beyond just Mr. Thompson and Chad. It could affect everyone who worked there, including the employees who had been loyal to the company for years. Meanwhile, Chad had started to crack. The weight of what was happening around him seemed to be sinking in. He no longer walked around with the same arrogance he once had. Instead, he spent most of his time at his desk, keeping his head down and avoiding eye contact with anyone who might question him. Brooklyn couldn't help but feel a slight sense of satisfaction watching him squirm. He had tried to act as though he was untouchable, but now he was facing the consequences of his blind ambition. One afternoon, as Brooklyn was walking through the hallway, she ran into Chad. For a moment, Neither of them said anything. Then he spoke, his voice low. "I know you think I got this promotion because of Mr. Thompson," Chad said, avoiding her gaze. "But I didn't ask for it. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to fit in. I wanted to be part of something." Brooklyn's eyes narrowed as she looked at him. This wasn't the Chad she had known before, the cocky, entitled coworker who thought the world owed him something. This was someone who was realizing the weight of his actions. For the first time, he seemed genuinely remorseful. "You should have thought about that before you got involved in this," Brooklyn said, her voice cold but controlled. "You're not the victim here, Chad. You were complicit in all of it. And now you're going to have to face the consequences." Chad looked up at her, his face full of shame. "I didn't know it would get this far. I didn't know he was stealing from the company." Brooklyn didn't respond. She had no sympathy left for him. She had fought for too long to be the one to show him mercy now. He had made his choice, and now he would have to live with it. The next day, the investigation reached a boiling point. The board, now fully aware of Mr. Thompson's financial crimes, began discussing the possibility of firing him immediately. Brooklyn had played her part, but she knew that the real work was just beginning. As the company prepared to make its next move, she felt a sense of justice in the air. This wasn't just about her career anymore. This was about taking down the corrupt forces that had tried to control everything. And Brooklyn was ready to lead the charge. The fallout from the investigation came quicker than Brooklyn expected. One morning, as she sat at her desk preparing for another round of meetings with the board, she received an email from HR. The subject line was simple: "Termination notice, Mr. Thompson." Her heart raced as she clicked on the message. It was official. Mr. Thompson had been dismissed from his position as CEO. The decision came after a series of emergency board meetings where Brooklyn's evidence had been reviewed in full. The company had finally taken a stand against the man who had spent years manipulating his way to the top, and the board knew they had no choice but to act. Brooklyn couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been overlooked, manipulated, or mistreated in the workplace. It felt like the weight of years of injustice had been lifted, and she was the one who had helped make it happen. But as the news spread, Brooklyn realized that this was just the beginning. The company had suffered a massive blow to its reputation. Not only had they lost their CEO, but the scandal surrounding Mr. Thompson's financial misconduct was making headlines in the industry. Investors were pulling out, employees were uncertain about the company's future, and the atmosphere in the office had shifted again. This wasn't the clean, straightforward victory she had hoped for. It was a complicated mess that would take time to untangle. Brooklyn knew it wasn't over yet. There were still questions to answer, relationships to rebuild, and people to win back. Despite the dismissal of Mr. Thompson, the company's future was still in jeopardy. The damage had been done, and now it was up to Brooklyn and the board to try to salvage what they could. Chad's role in the scandal was far from settled. He was still working in the company, but it was clear that his promotion would be revoked, and his position was under scrutiny. He had become a symbol of the system that had allowed Mr. Thompson to thrive. Brooklyn didn't feel sorry for him, but she couldn't help but wonder if he had learned anything from this experience. In the weeks that followed, she started to see subtle changes in him. Chad was quieter, more humble. There were no more cocky remarks or moments of arrogance. In fact, he seemed to be working harder than ever, trying to prove himself in a way that was, for the first time, genuine. But Brooklyn had made her peace with the fact that her journey didn't include saving Chad. She had bigger things to focus on now. With Mr. Thompson gone, the board turned to Brooklyn to help rebuild the company. They needed someone who understood the core values of the business, someone who had the vision and the integrity to lead. And to Brooklyn's surprise, they asked her to step up and take on a leadership role. It wasn't something she had expected, but it felt right. It felt like everything she had done, every late night, every ounce of energy spent uncovering the truth, had led to this moment. The board didn't offer her the CEO title, but they offered her something equally important: a seat at the table as the new head of marketing and strategy. It was a promotion that reflected her dedication, her intelligence, and most importantly, her unshakable moral compass. At first, Brooklyn hesitated. It wasn't just about the title. It was about the responsibility she had watched as the company fell apart under Mr. Thompson's leadership. Could she really take on the challenge of rebuilding it? Could she restore trust and credibility, not just within the company, but in the eyes of the public? But as Brooklyn sat in her new office for the first time, staring out at the city below, she felt a sense of clarity. This was her chance to make a difference. The company had been founded on the principles of hard work, trust, and integrity, and it was time to bring those values back to the forefront. She was no longer the person who had been overlooked. She was now a leader, tasked with rebuilding the company from the ground up. Days turned into weeks, and Brooklyn threw herself into her new role. She worked closely with the board to restructure the company, reviewing its values and practices to ensure that something like what happened with Mr. Thompson could never happen again. She brought in new leadership, focused on rebuilding relationships with key investors, and re-established the company's commitment to ethical business practices. Slowly but surely, the company began to regain its footing. As for Chad, his future remained uncertain. While he had been given a second chance to prove himself, Brooklyn made it clear that the company would no longer tolerate favoritism or shortcuts. Everyone, no matter their past, would be held accountable for their actions. She knew that some people might never fully recover from their mistakes, but she also knew that redemption was possible for those who were truly willing to change. Brooklyn's new role wasn't easy, but it was the most rewarding thing she had ever done. There were sleepless nights, difficult decisions, and moments of doubt, but with each step forward, she felt more confident in her ability to lead. She was no longer just a hardworking employee in the shadows. She was the one who had fought for justice and emerged victorious, and now she was helping to shape the future of the company in a way that honored the integrity she had always believed in. And as she sat at her desk one evening, reviewing reports and planning the next steps for the company's rebranding, Brooklyn couldn't help but smile. The road had been long and the battles had been hard, but she had come out stronger on the other side. She had learned that sometimes the best way to fight back wasn't by seeking revenge, but by becoming better. She wasn't just a victim of the system anymore. She was a leader in her own right, shaping the future in a way that no one could take away from her. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "We did it. The company is turning around. You're the reason for all of it." Brooklyn smiled and replied, "It's just the beginning." And in that moment, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. She was going to keep fighting for what was right, one step at a time. The weeks that followed were filled with change. The company, though still shaken from the scandal, was slowly beginning to recover. The new direction Brooklyn had set in motion was starting to show results. Investors were slowly returning, reassured by the company's new commitment to transparency and ethical business practices. Employees who had been uncertain about the future now felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing they were working for a company that valued integrity over shortcuts. Brooklyn's leadership was tested constantly. There were difficult conversations, tough decisions, and moments of doubt. But through it all, she remained steadfast in her commitment to doing what was right. She didn't just want to fix the company. She wanted to build something better, something that would stand the test of time. And with each challenge that came her way, Brooklyn grew more confident in her ability to lead. One morning, as she walked into the office, she noticed something that made her pause. The walls, once bare and tired-looking, were now filled with inspiring quotes, images of the team's achievements, and reminders of the values they had fought so hard to restore. The company had changed, and it wasn't just about profits anymore. It was about purpose. Brooklyn had come full circle. Not too long ago, she had been sitting in a small cubicle, feeling overlooked and unappreciated. Now, she was leading the company, pushing it to places it had never been before. She had faced betrayal, dishonesty, and adversity, but she had never wavered in her belief that doing the right thing was always the right choice. Then, one afternoon, there was a knock at her door. Brooklyn looked up to see Chad standing in the doorway, his expression much different from the arrogant, cocky man she had known. He looked tired, humbled. He stood there for a moment before speaking. "I wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice sincere, "for everything, for giving me a second chance, for showing me what leadership really means. I know I messed up. I didn't see the bigger picture before, but I get it now. I want to do better. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, but I am asking for a chance to prove myself." Brooklyn studied him carefully. She didn't respond immediately. She had heard enough empty apologies in her life to know when someone was being genuine, and this time, something in Chad's demeanor made her believe him. Maybe he had learned something from all of this. Maybe he hadn't fully understood the consequences of his actions, but now he was finally facing up to them. "I appreciate you saying that, Chad," Brooklyn replied after a moment. "But it's not about forgiveness. It's about showing up every day and earning the trust of the people around you. The company's future depends on everyone pulling their weight. No one is above that. If you're truly committed to being part of the team, then prove it. Let your actions speak for you." Chad nodded, looking determined. "I will." Brooklyn watched him leave, feeling a sense of closure. She didn't know if Chad would ever fully change, but that wasn't her responsibility anymore. She had done her part. Now it was up to him to decide what kind of person he wanted to be. As the months went by, Brooklyn saw more and more signs that the company was on the right path. The rebranding had been a success, and their marketing campaigns were getting noticed again. Employees were motivated, the office was buzzing with creativity, and for the first time in a long while, Brooklyn felt like she wasn't just surviving in the corporate world, she was thriving. One late evening, as she was leaving the office, Brooklyn stopped at the elevator and took a deep breath. The building was quieter than usual, but she felt at peace. The battle had been long, but she had won. She had taken down the corruption that had nearly destroyed everything she cared about and had come out stronger on the other side. The elevator doors opened, and Brooklyn stepped inside. As she rode down to the parking garage, she thought about everything she had been through, the betrayals, the fights, the long nights spent working toward a future that seemed so uncertain. But through it all, she had stayed true to herself. She had fought for integrity, for fairness, and for the company's future. And now, as she looked forward to the next chapter, Brooklyn knew that she had built something worth fighting for. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time, she felt completely confident that whatever came next, she was ready for it. She wasn't just the woman who had exposed a corrupt CEO and taken down a system built on favoritism. She was a leader, a fighter, and most importantly, she was someone who believed that change was possible, even in the darkest moments. As the elevator doors opened, Brooklyn stepped out into the night. The world felt different now, as if anything was possible, and she was ready to face whatever came her way, one step at a time.